Now, some of you might remember that I made a video a while back about the brushes that I personally use, and this isn't really that video. In fact, one of the reasons I wanted to make this one is because over the last couple of years I've tried so many different brushes that I eventually found myself asking a completely different question. Not what brush do I use, but what actually makes a paintbrush good? Because I've bought an embarrassing number of them over the years. Winsor & Newton, Artis Opus, Skoda, Chimera, Rosemary & Co, Cryptic, Cabin, Broken Toad, Raphael, Da Vinci, Citadel, Orange, Tesseract, Hawk Miniatures, AK, Monument Hobbies, Vaiho, Hobby Brothers, Tintoretto, Foxbite, Golden Maple, and probably several others that I've even forgotten about or actively chosen to forget because I don't particularly want to think about how much money I've spent on paintbrushes. I've also been fortunate enough to have a number of paintbrushes sent to me by manufacturers over the years. Whenever that's happened, I've always made it very clear to them that they'll be judged in exactly the same way as everything else I own, because I don't really see the point in recommending something that I wouldn't genuinely use myself. And if I'm honest, I think I fell into exactly the same trap that most miniature painters do, because sooner or later, you see somebody paint an incredible miniature, you ask them what paintbrush they use, they tell you, and a tiny part of your brain immediately decides that you've identified the missing ingredient. That elusive brand of brush that's somehow going to magically fix your paint jobs. Now, yes, moving from the battered synthetic starter brush you've had since the dawn of time to a decent natural hairbrush is usually a genuine upgrade. But I think we all know that finding the magic fix my paint jobs brush is nonsense, and yet I also think most of us have spent plenty of cash hunting for that elusive holy grail. So today, I'd like to try and answer a question. Do expensive paintbrushes actually matter? And I guess the frustrating answer is, well, yes, but also no. Because if expensive paintbrushes automatically meant better brushes, this video would be very short. We could all just buy the most expensive thing available and go home, but that hasn't really been my experience. In fact, in the last couple of years, I've worked through a huge selection of brushes ranging from suspiciously affordable all the way through to, I hope my wife never discovers how much this cost me. I tested them on the things I actually spend my time doing, that is to say, I just use them in my daily painting. The first problem with most paintbrush discussions is that we spend a huge amount of time talking about brands and price and surprisingly little time talking about what a brush is actually doing. And before we get there, we probably need to acknowledge something else. Brushes are, surprise, surprise, quite a personal thing. There are absolutely some things we can talk about objectively, whether a brush forms a sharp point, whether it holds that point, how much paint it carries in the belly, how long it lasts, whether it splits, whether it ends up looking like Phil Spector's pubes before the first week is out. Those things matter. But then there are other things that come down to personal opinion, because we're not talking purely about quality anymore, we're talking about comfort, we're talking about preferences. We're talking about what feels right in your hand after several hundred hours of painting. And the other thing that doesn't get discussed enough is that different painters often need different things. If you're just getting started, durability and value are probably far more important than absolute precision. If you're painting armies, you might care about entirely different characteristics than somebody preparing a Golden Demon entry. And if you're painting the display pieces for competition, consistency and predictability suddenly become extremely important because you're spending more than dozens or hundreds of hours on a single model. So when somebody tells you that a particular brush is the best brush they've ever used, they are absolutely correct for them. And that's probably not a particularly satisfying answer. So rather than spending the next 10 minutes talking about brushes in the abstract, let's actually look at some. Because I think each one that I've used has taught me something slightly different about what actually makes a good brush. Now, before we jump in, a quick test. Here are 10 size 1 Kolinsky Sable paintbrushes. Could you tell me, without looking at the brands, which cost £30 and which cost just over £3? What about these 11 size 2 brushes? No? Beyond recognising one or two aspects of each brush, like handle or ferro colour, I suspect they all look basically the same to most people. So let's see if we can demystify some of that. Let's start with Hawk Miniatures. I wanted to begin here because I actually think these are one of the easiest recommendations I can make to somebody who's just started and wants to move beyond those first synthetic brushes. Not because they're the absolute pinnacle of all brushes I've ever used, they are great, don't get me wrong, but because they're one of the most affordable ways I've found of experiencing what a great natural hair brush actually feels like. Natural hair brushes generally hold more paint, they maintain a sharper point, and once you've spent a little time with one, they tend to feel a lot nicer to paint with. They also don't form a hook after periods of use. The problem is that most of the brands people recommend when they talk about natural hair brushes cost so much that a beginner's understandably terrified of ruining one. You get paint in the ferrule once and suddenly you're staring at 15 to 20 quid wondering where it all went wrong. Hawk Miniatures massively lowers that barrier. You can experience the advantages of a natural hair brush without feeling like you've just taken out a small loan. In fact, I liked them enough that I ended up working with John at Hawk on my own Essentials set, but that is not the point. The point is that they're one of the few brushes I'd happily recommend to somebody who isn't even sure they'll enjoy miniature painting yet. And one thing I do find interesting, and something that almost nobody talks about in brush reviews, is the handle. Some people absolutely love a really light brush, others prefer something with a bit more girth. When we were putting together the Essentials set, we actually ended up producing both a standard handle and a thicker walnut version because it very quickly became obvious that painters don't actually agree on tools. Some people prefer the lighter version, others like the thicker walnut handles. Neither group is wrong, it's just preference. Now, at almost the opposite end of the spectrum cost-wise sits this, the Tintoretto Series 37. This was a completely chance purchase at SMC last year, and if I'm honest, it's probably become my favourite brush. Not because it's Italian, not because it's expensive, but because this thing just refuses to stop being sharp. Every now and then you buy a brush that makes you stop halfway through painting and think, right, okay, this is it. And for me, this was one of those brushes, which naturally brings us on to the first thing people usually look at, the point. Can the brush form a sharp point and keep it? Can it recover that point after you've been abusing it for 3 months straight? However, for me, a beautiful point isn't much use if the brush hardly carries any paint. I have to take too many trips back to the palette, or if the paint dries on the tip before I've even got to the model, we're in trouble. So I also value a reasonably sized belly. But at the same time, I don't want my brush to be way too long. So there's a sweet spot where the brush is not too long, has enough of a belly for the water and paint, and keeps that tip super sharp. And I'm here for that Goldilocks zone. And actually over time what I've realised is that the characteristic I value most isn't actually point retention, belly or brush size, it's trust. When I pick this brush up, do I know what it's going to do? Can I rely on it? Does it behave consistently? Because after a certain point, I don't think you're paying for a sharper tip anymore. I think you're paying for confidence and consistency. And then we get to probably the biggest surprise, Golden Maple. Golden Maple sent me a set of rounds and a set of arrowhead brushes a while ago, and if I'm being completely honest, I was initially very sceptical. But they exceeded my expectations by quite a margin. The points have lasted far longer than I expected. The brushes have lasted far longer than I expected. In fact, if you'd handed me these without telling me what they cost, I think I'd have guessed that they were a considerably more expensive brush. As you might expect, those arrowheads have this wonderful combination of sharp and flat, and they're probably a little stiffer than round brushes, which keeps that tip a little bit more stable. And they continue to find their way onto my desk despite having plenty of alternatives sitting nearby. And actually, that's become one of my favourite ways of judging brushes. Ignore what I tell you, ignore what any reviewer tells you, which brush actually ends up sitting next to your water pot or palette every evening. Because your actions tell the truth, right? The brushes you genuinely trust are the ones that you reach for time and time again. Now, I've had a very similar experience with Orange's size 2 round and Tesseract Miniatures Workhorse brush. Both have maintained really nice points, both feel predictable, both have become brushes I reach for without really thinking about it. Now, I don't think either of them has quite matched the Tintoretto in terms of longevity for me, and this is for me specifically, but considering what they cost, they are incredibly compelling brushes. And again, this starts making me question the whole idea that price and quality move perfectly together. They don't. They correlate, absolutely, but they don't move in lockstep. And while we're on the topic of price, Winsor & Newton are an interesting brand because they're probably still the default recommendation in miniature painting from a lot of painters, but also the most expensive. And for good reason. When you get a good Series 7, they're fantastic. My only observation is that I've encountered enough variation over the years now that I prefer buying them in person wherever possible, because if I'm spending that sort of money, I'd quite like to inspect the point before I hand over the dosh. Now, before somebody rushes into the comments to tell me that I haven't mentioned Rosemary & Co. or Raphael or Escoda or Da Vinci or Artis Opus or Vallejo or Broken Toad, I know there are loads of excellent brushes, and honestly, I think that's the biggest lesson this whole ridiculous exercise has taught me. I don't think there's a single best paintbrush. I think there are brushes that suit different painters, different techniques, different budgets, different stages of your painting journey. If you're painting your first Space Marine, your priorities are completely different to somebody spending hundreds of hours preparing a Golden Demon entry. If you're painting armies, your priorities are different again. And once you realise that, you stop chasing brands and price tags, and you stop assuming that more expensive automatically means better. And instead, you start asking much more useful questions. Does it carry enough paint? Does it keep a point? Do I like the handle? Does it feel predictable? Can I trust it? Does it suit the way I paint? Because those are the questions that are important. So, do expensive paintbrushes matter? Yes, absolutely. Some of them are exceptional. But the biggest lesson I've learned after buying an embarrassing number of them is that price is only one part of the equation. The best brush isn't necessarily the most expensive one. It isn't even the one that your favourite painter uses. It's the one that you stop thinking about, the one that becomes an extension of your hand, the one that's always sitting at your painting area when you come back to paint your miniatures. That's probably your best brush. If you've got a go-to brush that you swear by, I genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me why you like it rather than just the brand name, because that's the interesting bit. And if you're a brush manufacturer who thinks I've missed something, by all means get in touch, because buying every brush myself isn't proving to be a particularly sustainable business model. If you enjoyed this slightly more thoughtful look at painting tools, let me know. I'm enjoying making these videos that explore why we do things rather than simply how we do them, and I'd love to know if you're enjoying them too. Until next time, go finish something.